William Sullivan stares at the morning news on his phone, his coffee growing cold as he reads the headline for the fourth time. Best-selling cookbook author's hidden truth, a marriage recipe for disaster. The photograph shows his ex-wife Margaret holding her book, Recipes for Healing, with a knowing smile that makes his stomach turn. The article dissects her recipes line by line, connecting her seemingly innocent cooking stories to 20 years of marriage to a prominent tech executive. They don't name him directly, but everyone in Silicon Valley knows exactly who she's writing about. The salmon recipe on page 43 describes a husband who criticized the seasoning while never acknowledging the hours of preparation, the journalist writes. The chocolate cake recipe mentions celebrations where only his achievements mattered. He scrolls through the comments. Thousands of women sharing their own stories, praising Margaret's brave honesty and brilliant metaphors. His hands shake as he realizes that his ex-wife has turned their private moments into public judgment. The woman he left with nothing has just destroyed everything he built. If stories like this remind you of your own journey, whether in cooking, healing, or finding your voice, I'd love to hear where you're listening from in the comments. These quiet acts of courage deserve to be witnessed. Please subscribe for more stories about the strength we discover when we're pushed to our limits. William Sullivan built his fortune on disruption. As CEO of Next Tech Solutions, he prided himself on identifying inefficiencies and eliminating them. His Palo Alto mansion reflected this philosophy. Sleek lines, minimal decoration, everything serving a purpose, including his wife. For 20 years, Margaret Sullivan had been the perfect accessory to his success. She hosted dinner parties for investors, attended charity galas, and managed their household with invisible precision. Every morning, she prepared his breakfast exactly as he liked it. Steel-cut oats with blueberries, coffee black, served at precisely 7:15. William never questioned this routine. Margaret simply made his life work, like a well-programmed system that required no maintenance or appreciation. But systems could be upgraded. When William turned 55, he decided his life needed a different kind of efficiency. His assistant, Jessica, was 32 with an MBA from Stanford. She understood his business language, shared his ambitions, and looked perfect on his arm at industry conferences. The divorce was handled like any other business transaction. William's lawyers presented Margaret with papers that left her with minimal assets, enough to rent a modest apartment, but not enough to maintain the lifestyle she'd known. California's community property laws meant little when faced with teams of expensive attorneys and hidden offshore accounts. "You'll be fine," William told her during their final meeting, signing papers in his lawyer's conference room. Margaret sat across from him, wearing the same navy dress she'd worn to their first charity gala 20 years earlier. She'd lost weight during the divorce proceedings, and the dress hung loose on her frame. But her posture remained straight, her hands folded calmly in her lap. "I cooked for you every day for 20 years. I never burned a meal. I never served you anything I wouldn't eat myself." William barely looked up from the papers. "I'm sure you'll find someone else to cook for." Margaret's green eyes met his for a moment, and something flickered there. Not anger, but a kind of quiet resolve that made him shift uncomfortably in his chair. "Yes," she said, "I think I will." 3 months later, William married Jessica in a ceremony that made the society pages. Margaret wasn't invited,
but she read about it online from her one-bedroom apartment in San Jose. She looked at the photos of the elaborate reception, the same caterers she'd once hired for their dinner parties, the same flowers she'd chosen for their anniversary celebrations. Then she opened her laptop and began to write. The first recipe she typed was for steel-cut oats with blueberries. But instead of just listing ingredients, she wrote about the ritual of preparation, rising at 6:30 every morning, measuring the oats precisely, timing the cooking so everything would be ready exactly when he expected it. Some husbands, she wrote, believe that breakfast appears by magic, that the perfect temperature and timing happen without thought or effort. They eat quickly, checking emails, never noticing the care that went into each bite. Margaret stared at the words on her screen. They looked like a simple recipe story, but she knew they were something else entirely. They were the beginning of her own recipe for healing, and perhaps, though she didn't admit it to herself yet, her recipe for revenge.
6 months after the divorce, Margaret published Recipes for Healing through a small women's press. The book appeared to be a simple cookbook, comfort food recipes paired with gentle stories about recovery and self-discovery. Food bloggers praised its authentic voice and emotional honesty. But Margaret had written something far more sophisticated than a cookbook. Each recipe contained carefully crafted stories about a marriage that slowly drained a woman's spirit, told through the lens of shared meals and kitchen memories. The roast chicken recipe described Sunday dinners where she carved the bird perfectly, only to hear criticism about the seasoning, while he took credit for choosing the wine. The chocolate chip cookie recipe mentioned baking treats for his business associates, then watching him dismiss her contribution as just something Margaret threw together. Women began buying the book by the thousands. They recognized something in Margaret's stories, the invisible labor, the constant criticism disguised as helpful suggestions, the way their own contributions had been minimized and dismissed. Food Network invited Margaret for an interview. She appeared on camera wearing a simple blue apron demonstrating her recipe for courage soup, a hearty vegetable stew that sustained her through difficult times. "Cooking taught me that good things take time," she told the host. "You can't rush the process. You have to be patient, let things develop naturally. And sometimes you have to be willing to start over completely." The interview went viral. Women shared it across social media, adding their own stories of cooking through heartbreak, of finding strength in the simple act of nourishing others and themselves. William watched the interview from his office, his jaw clenching as he recognized every story Margaret told. The businessman husband who criticized every meal, the successful executive who never once thanked her for 20 years of perfectly prepared food. His assistant Jessica knocked on his door. "William, I think we need to talk about the book." She handed him a printout of Margaret's interview transcript, certain passages highlighted in yellow. She's starting to connect the dots. Tech blogs are speculating about which Silicon Valley CEO she's writing about. William read the highlighted sections, his face growing pale. Margaret had been devastatingly careful, never naming him directly, but including details that anyone in their social circle would recognize. "She's destroying my reputation," he said. "She's telling her story. There's a difference." William looked up at his new wife, hearing something in her tone that made him uncomfortable. "You don't believe this nonsense, do you?" Jessica was quiet for a moment.
I believe she cooked for you every day for 20 years. I believe you never once thanked her. I believe you left her with nothing while keeping everything for yourself." She set another document on his desk. A legal separation agreement. "I'm moving out, William. I won't be part of your next chapter." As Jessica left his office, William realized that Margaret's quiet revenge was just beginning. She hadn't just written a cookbook. She'd written a mirror, and everyone who looked into it could see exactly what kind of man he really was.
The tipping point came during Margaret's book tour. A journalist from the San Francisco Chronicle attended her reading at a bookstore in Berkeley, then spent 3 weeks investigating the prominent tech executive mentioned in her stories. The article, titled "The Recipe for Emotional Abuse: A Tech Mogul's 20-Year Marriage," connected every detail. William's name appeared in the second paragraph, followed by a comprehensive examination of his business practices, his treatment of female employees, and his pattern of replacing inefficient relationships when they no longer served his purposes. The story went national within hours. CNN picked it up, then the Washington Post, then the New York Times. Social media exploded with women sharing their own stories of emotional manipulation, using Margaret's recipes as metaphors for their own experiences. #RecipesForHealing became a trending hashtag. Women posted photos of themselves cooking Margaret's dishes, sharing stories of their own recoveries from toxic relationships. William's board of directors called an emergency meeting. Investors were pulling out. Major contracts were being reconsidered. The company's stock price dropped 15% in 2 days. "This is a personal matter," William told the board. "It has nothing to do with Nextech." Board member Patricia Chen shook her head. "William, half our customers are women. They're not going to support a company run by someone who treated his wife like unpaid domestic staff for 20 years. "He gave her everything she wanted," William protested. "You gave her nothing she needed," Patricia replied. "And now the whole world knows it." The board voted to place William on indefinite leave while they conducted a full review of his leadership. That evening, he sat alone in his empty house, scrolling through hundreds of social media posts from women who'd found strength in Margaret's words. One post particularly stung. A woman had photographed Margaret's recipe for freedom bread, a simple sourdough recipe that required daily attention and patience. "Like healing, this bread cannot be rushed. You must tend it carefully, trust the process, and believe that something beautiful will emerge from the simplest ingredients." The woman had written, "I made this bread every day for 6 months after leaving my husband. Each loaf reminded me that I was worth the time and effort. Margaret Sullivan gave me more than recipes. She gave me permission to value myself." William closed his laptop and walked to his kitchen. The same kitchen where Margaret had prepared thousands of meals, where she'd stood every morning making his breakfast while he read emails and ignored her completely. For the first time in 20 years, William tried to cook for himself. He burned the eggs. He couldn't find the salt. He realized he didn't even know where Margaret kept the basic supplies that had magically appeared at every meal. He sat on the kitchen floor, surrounded by his failures, and finally understood what he'd lost. Not just a wife, but the person who'd made his life possible. The woman who'd given him everything, while he'd given her nothing in return. And now she was gone, taking with her the only version of himself that had ever been worth anything.
William spent 2 weeks in isolation, watching his life disintegrate from the inside of his empty mansion. Nextech's board announced his permanent removal as CEO. 3 major clients terminated their contracts. His assets were frozen pending a federal investigation into his business practices. But the worst part was the silence. No phone calls from friends, no invitations to events, no acknowledgement of his existence beyond the constant media coverage of his downfall. He tried to contact Margaret through her publisher, but they refused to forward his messages. He drove to her apartment building, but the security guard had been instructed not to let him in. Finally, he did something he'd never done in his adult life. He went to a bookstore and bought a copy of Margaret's book. Reading Recipes for Healing was like looking at his marriage through Margaret's eyes for the first time. Every recipe told a story of neglect, dismissal, and emotional cruelty that he'd never recognized in himself. The beef stew recipe described a woman who learned to cook in silence because her husband found her voice annoying during his evening news. The apple pie recipe mentioned celebrations where her contributions were acknowledged only as Margaret's little hobby. He read every word, recognizing himself in every cruel detail. This wasn't vindictive fiction. This was documentary evidence of 20 years of emotional abuse, recorded in recipe form and served to the world with devastating accuracy. He found Margaret's phone number through a private investigator and called her every day for a week. She never answered, but he left voicemails anyway. "Margaret, I know you'll never forgive me," he said in one message. "But I need you to know that I'm finally seeing what I did to you. I'm finally understanding what I destroyed." He paused, staring out at the garden she'd maintained for 2 decades, now overgrown and dying without her care. He continued, "I don't want your forgiveness. I just want you to know that your book is the most honest thing anyone has ever written about me. And I'm sorry it took losing everything to make me understand how much I'd already lost." Margaret listened to his voicemails from her small apartment, but she never called back. She was busy with her new life: book signings, speaking engagements, cooking classes for women recovering from difficult relationships. She'd found her voice, and it was stronger than she'd ever imagined. William's voicemails continued for another week, growing more desperate and self-aware. But Margaret had learned something important from 20 years of marriage. She didn't owe him her attention, her forgiveness, or her energy. She had recipes to write, women to feed, and a life to rebuild. William Sullivan had taken enough of her time already.
1 year after the book's publication, William drove to the community center where Margaret taught cooking classes for women in transition. He didn't go inside. He just sat in his car, watching through the windows as she demonstrated knife techniques to a group of women who hung on her every word. Margaret moved with confidence and grace, her hair shorter now, her clothes brighter. She laughed easily with her students, encouraging them when they struggled, celebrating their small victories. She was the same woman who'd cooked for him every day for 20 years, but she was also completely transformed. This Margaret commanded respect, demanded attention, and received both freely. William pulled out his phone and called her one final time. This time she answered. "Hello, William? I'm outside the community center," he said. "I can see you teaching. You look happy." "I am happy," Margaret replied. "Is there something you need?" William watched as she continued teaching while talking to him, never missing a beat in her demonstration. She had learned to multitask in ways that didn't involve sacrificing herself. "I wanted to tell you that I've been cooking. Your recipes. I'm terrible at it, but I'm learning." Margaret smiled slightly, though he couldn't see it. "Which recipes?" "The courage soup, the freedom bread, the one for healing pasta that you wrote about starting over. Those are good choices. They're forgiving recipes, hard to ruin completely. William laughed, surprised by the sound of his own voice. I ruined them anyway. But I keep trying. That's the point. The trying. They were quiet for a moment, both watching her students work with vegetables and herbs, learning to nourish themselves and others. You wrote in an interview where you said forgiveness is like sourdough starter. It takes time to develop and you can't rush the process. I also said that some bread just isn't worth the effort. Not everything can be saved. William nodded, understanding that this was as close to closure as they would ever get. Margaret had written her truth, found her voice, and built a new life. His opinion of that life was no longer relevant. I'm proud of you, for the book, for the teaching, for all of it. Thank you, Margaret said simply. Take care of yourself, William. Learn to cook for yourself with the same care you'd show someone you love. She hung up before he could respond. William sat in his car for another hour, watching Margaret teach her students about seasoning, timing, and the patience required to create something nourishing from simple ingredients. Then he drove home to practice making bread, knowing that Margaret would never taste it, but understanding finally that some things were worth doing simply because they were worth doing. In her kitchen, Margaret continued teaching, showing women how to trust their instincts, how to adjust recipes to their own tastes, how to feed themselves and others with intention and care. She never mentioned the phone call, but later that evening, she wrote a new recipe for her next book, one about second chances, the difference between redemption and forgiveness, and the wisdom to know which battles are worth fighting. Some ingredients, she wrote, improve with time. Others are best left behind entirely.